3, 2, 1, go ahead.
My name is Eva Schloss. Would you like to ask me some questions about my life?
Why don't you ask me a question about Auschwitz?
Why don't you ask me a question about Auschwitz? Everybody said, never again Auschwitz, we have learned our lesson. But it looked bad again in the world, the hatred, discrimination. So I thought it really necessary to teach and to speak about it.
My name is Pinchas Guter. I will answer any questions you might have for me.
How old were you when the war ended?
I was between the ages of 13 and 14 when the war ended in 1945.
But he doesn't move much, really.
And that's his choice.
Well, it's very Jewish to talk with your hands.
Yes, it is.
And you should feel comfortable to do.
And you can.
Exactly.
You can.
Yeah, yeah.
It's going to be somewhat normal in 100 years' time to have a person sitting in this position, and it won't seem as unnatural. When you start to get into the questions and you start to get into the dialogue, you kind of lose sight of the fact that the person's not actually there.
Gosh, my goodness.
This is Andrew.
Yes.
Hi, Andrew.
Eva.
Nice to meet you. Lisa.
This is Lisa, her granddaughter.
Right now there's about 100 cameras on the stage, so we're recording everything in all directions. The idea behind the green is that we can then take out the green and replace it with any other environment that you're going to be talking in the future. So this could be a classroom, it could be a museum, and we can put those backdrops behind you.
In the beginning, I didn't know really how to speak. You know, it's something you have to learn. Eventually, I found my own voice. Okay, here we go.
Good morning.
Good morning.
How are you?
I'm feeling very well, a little nervous.
Okay. When did you first start telling your story?
Since 1986, I started to speak for the first time, and I haven't really stopped since.
Today is October the 9th, 1996. The survivor being interviewed is Eva Schloss, maiden name Geringer.
I realized suddenly that people are interested and people do want to know about it. And this was really a big turning point in my life.
This is a repeat after me. My name is Eva Schloss, and I'm a Holocaust survivor.
My name is Eva Schloss. I'm a Holocaust survivor.
I'm actually a recording, so I can't answer that question.
I'm actually recording. I can't answer that question.
I don't remember.
I don't remember.
Maybe you should try to reboot.
Maybe you should try to
Reboot.
rebook.
Reboot.
Rebook.
Okay, never mind. Never mind.
Too technical for me. I don't quite imagine how people will feel about that, to pretend it is somebody really speaking to them who lived in that time 30 or 50 years ago.
How did it feel to wear the yellow star, Eva?
I was quite a stubborn child, and I didn't want to wear the yellow star. I didn't see why that was necessary, and I had a big fight with my mother. I didn't want to, but my mother explained to me very, very carefully and thoroughly why it was dangerous not to wear it.
Can I just tell you, these answers are great. They're just the right length with the right amount of details. Wonderful.
Thank you.
What happened when you arrived at Auschwitz?
Men and women were separated, so people cling to each other and cried, and really, really horrible. And the guards came and beat us apart. And my father took me by the hand and said, Ewertje, God will protect you. I often think of actors who do every day the same story. I vary it because if I would do the same thing all the time, then I might get fed up with it.
Have you come up with a name for the contraption that you're in yet?
Cage.
The cage. Okay.
So describe to us the most emotional situation that you had to face while you were in Auschwitz-Birkenau.
I think the biggest shock I experienced was when I saw my naked mother walking out of this barrack, knowing that she was going to be gassed. I think that was the hardest moment I experienced.
And was she?
She was saved and we were very united. And she lived for a long, long time, till 93 years old. I'd always seen it in front of my eyes. So I lived with it, really, you know? I saw the inside of the cattle truck where we were moved. I saw the arrival in Auschwitz. I saw everything at night, especially when I was not busy. You know, all those images came back. Till I started to speak about, then I could let go.
Okay, this is over here, right here. These are the gas chambers over here in this area. And these are the forests around here.
Yeah.
The pond where you would have gone to get water is all around this area here.
How does it make you feel looking at that?
Still very confused, because when you were inside, you had no idea
Of how big it was around it.
and where and what and how things were
exactly.
connected to it.
Yeah.
There's not a day goes by when I'm not thinking about them in one way or another. I wasn't coping at all after the war. And it was Otto Frank who came very often to our house, who saw how I was suffering, and he really helped me a lot. I don't think I ever replaced Anna for him. I personally had the feeling very often, but that he never ever made me really think that, but I just felt it, that when he looked at me, I always thought, is he thinking why did this child survive and why not my own daughter?
Do you remember how you felt about Anne after you read the diary?
I must say I wasn't particularly interested in it at first.
Why not?
I was much too busy to cope with my own grief. Otto Frank says in her diary, when she dies, she would like to live on, meaning she wants to become immortal, and she has succeeded.
How did your daughters cope with having two parents who both experienced trauma?
As soon as they were teenagers and older and started to know more about our history, I think they had difficulties to cope with it, to accept it.
She told us sort of anecdotes and stories, but it was almost like it was someone else's experiences, not her own.
I think there was a certain time where she didn't want to talk about it and was protecting us.
Our whole generation has been uprooted, and as a result of the experiences through which all of us have gone, we have some psychological problems, all of us, one kind or another, and our anchor to the future is our children and grandchildren, which hopefully will find back into normality.
Great day, great day. You're gonna miss us though.
I'll miss it?
Yeah, you're gonna miss
I'm not so sure. So, back to normality.
Normality. And then you still pick to wear grey. Silver.
Yeah, well, I can't go right into a colour after all this.
You need to ease yourself back to colour.
Understand. There we go. Usually, twice a week, I go out speaking. I said to my daughters who think I don't have to do all this, I need that for my sanity. Too hot? Mm-hmm. I got over it, the suffering. The only thing what I still don't get over really, and I don't think I ever will, is the loss.
This project will almost immortalize her so that she can go on telling the story once she's no longer with us. But it is still a story. Really, it's what it is. Unless you live through it, you can't fully identify.
I hope you don't forget what you've heard here today. Goodbye.
Today, we are very honored to hear Miss Eva Schloss, a Holocaust survivor, speaker, and author. She is Anne Frank's posthumous stepsister. Ms. Schloss was born in a peaceful and tolerant Vienna in 1929, where she lived until the rising anti-Semitism of Nazi Austria forced her family to flee first to Brussels and then to Amsterdam in 1940, where they, like the Franks, were forced to go into hiding. They lived in their respective hiding places until her 15th birthday, when her entire family was betrayed, arrested by the Nazis, and sent to concentration camps. She and her mother were subjected to the unspeakable horrors of the Holocaust in Auschwitz for 9 months. Auschwitz was liberated by the Russian army in January of 1945, and Miss Schloss and her mother returned to Amsterdam, where they met Otto Frank, who had also returned from Auschwitz. He had recently discovered Anne's diary, and as we know, spent the rest of his life spreading its message. After he and her mother eventually married, Miss Schloss became Anne's stepsister. After being asked to speak during an opening of the Anne Frank exhibition in 1985, Miss Schloss spoke after a long time of her experiences in the Holocaust. Ever since then, she has traveled the world and told her story in an effort to educate and not allow the traumatic events of her childhood to be repeated. Her life was forever altered by the events of the Holocaust, and she is here now to share them with us, to persuade us that something that horrific and hateful should never happen again. Listen carefully, because the number of survivors decreases every year. Take advantage of this amazing opportunity. With this in mind, please join us in welcoming Holocaust survivor, international speaker, author, and human rights activist, Miss Eva Schloss.
Everybody. It's wonderful to be here with you today and to see such a full house. And I hope it will be an hour which you will always remember. Thank you very much.
I feel like I'm about to interview the Queen of England. Eva, you had a happy family life in Vienna. And then your family was forced to move first to Brussels and then to Amsterdam. Can you walk us through those early years, please?
Yes, we were a Jewish family living in Vienna, Austria, which is a beautiful city, lots of culture, but as well wonderful surroundings, mountains and lakes. And I was a very sporty child. I loved to go with my father to do mountain climbing and in the winter skiing. I had an older brother, we had grandparents, aunts, uncle, a big extended family, and life was really very, very wonderful. But all this stopped in March 1938. I was just 9 years old when Hitler, without permission, just marched into Austria with his army and occupied the country. The Austrian people, from one day to the next, became suddenly ardent Nazis. They stood in the street with the Heil Hitler salute, all with the big swastika flags, and life changed for us immediately. It is unbelievable how from one day to the next, the spirit, the friendship has changed. My brother Heinz, he was 12 years old. Of course, he went to school the next day, so did I. And he came home, and he looked terrible. His clothes were torn, he was beaten up. When my parents saw him, they were in shock. She said, "What on earth has happened to you?" And he said, "My own friends did that, and the teachers just let it happen and looked on." So you can imagine, it was unbelievable. And my best friend was a Catholic girl, and after school I usually went home to her. We did a bit of game or gossiping. But the next day as well, when I went there, when the mother saw me, I could see she looked very cross. And when she opened the door, she said to me, "We will never want to see you here again." And she slammed the door in my face. I went home crying. I said to my mother, "I don't understand. We didn't have a quarrel." And my mother said, "Well, for Jewish people, life is going to be really, really terrible from now on. And the trouble was that most people, most Jewish people, felt threatened, but to get out of the country and to get visas in safe countries was practically impossible in 1938. In Germany, Hitler had already started with the anti-Jewish measures. People had been arrested, people had lost their jobs, people had been beaten up, and of course we expect in Austria the same will happen. But my father had business connections in Holland, and he left immediately. You know, we didn't quite understand children. Parents tried to protect us, but obviously they had planned that if something like that would happen, my father would get away. But when we wanted to follow, it was impossible already. Then we heard that we could go illegally over the border into Belgium, taking big, big risks. So we did that. Once you were in the country, you could stay, but you were not welcomed. We were Jewish refugees. People really didn't want to mix with us. I went to school, of course, a French-speaking school. I was put in the end of the class, and the teacher said to me, I didn't understand, but she said, just follow the lessons. I had no idea what's going on. I felt a really outcast. Eventually, I did learn my language a little bit, and I made some friends with some little girls. And it was my 10th birthday. We lived in a boarding house, and in Vienna, I had always lovely birthday parties, and I was really keen to have another birthday party. And the owner of the boarding house said, yes, you can invite 5 girls. So I did. I gave out notices, and I was very excited. And the day of my birthday, all those girls brought a note from their parents that they were not allowed to come to my party. Can you imagine how I felt? I felt a real outcast. In the meantime, Hitler had gone already into Denmark and Norway, and the war had started. And my father tried desperately to get a visa for us to come into Holland as well. And eventually in May, during the war, in March 1940, he got a visa for us to visit him for 3 months in Amsterdam. And my father took a furnished apartment, and we settled down there.
So then you...
I met, of course.
And you met Anne. And tell us about Anne.
If you live in an apartment, not in houses, that wasn't really possible in Holland because it's quite a small country. We had a nice little apartment, but no yards for children to play. And so all the children of the neighborhood came out on this big open space. And one day, a little girl came to me, very polite, introduced herself. My name is Otto Frank. We were both 11 years old at the time, and it was quite interesting. Anne went not to the local school, I went to the ordinary local school, but she went to a Montessori school, which is a bit special. Her older sister didn't, she went to the ordinary school. But so her father must have realized that she needed a bit extra attention. And she was a big, big chatterbox. Her nickname was Mrs. Quack Quack. And very often she had to stay behind in class and write, I don't know if you have to do that sometimes, to write 100 lines of I'm not going to talk so much in class. But she couldn't help it, you know. After a week again, she had to stay behind again. And when I told her I had an older brother with 11, she said, oh, when can I come and meet him? Because she was already quite a big flirt. For me, boys were, you know, boys came into the house all the time, so there was no mystery. But when she heard I had a brother, she was quite jealous. She said, I only have a sister. And so life started to be, the Dutch people were very, very nice. I looked Dutch, I had blonde hair and blue eyes. I got a bicycle, everybody has a bicycle, and we settled down. But it didn't last long. In May, the Nazis invaded that country as well.
Can you tell us about your going into hiding and then being betrayed?
Well, first, of course, there were measures against the Jewish people. We had to wear the yellow star. We were not allowed to go on public transport. We had to hand in our bicycle. We had house arrest after 8 o'clock. We were not allowed to go out. And it was a nuisance. It was not dangerous as such, you know. And we thought, well, we could cope with that. But then we had to leave our schools and go to Jewish schools. And that was already becoming really dangerous. The Nazis went into the schools, told some of the classrooms, we have a truck downstairs, go in the truck. In the evenings, the parents waited for the children to come home, and they never turned up. So they went to the local police to try to find out, and they never got any answer. So children were never ever seen again. Only after the war did one hear they were taken to a terrible, terrible Austrian death camp and just thrown down from the cliffs there. You can imagine, you know, my brother who turned 16, he even didn't dare to go out in the street because very often people were just picked up from the street. After 2 years, 10,000 young people, you could have been included, from 16 on, we got a call-up notice to be deported to Germany. And that was when many Jewish parents said, we are not going to send our children, it's dangerous, they don't trust the Germans. And my father called us together, and they said they found some wonderful Dutch people who are going to share their homes with us. But he didn't find, as I say, people live in rather small apartment. I couldn't find a family who was taking in 4 people, so we have to split up. And I started to cry. I didn't want to be separated. And my father explained, if we're in 2 different places, the chance that 2 of us will survive is bigger. Survive. So that was the first time with 13 years old that I realized it might be a matter of life and death. And that is really quite scary. So we went into hiding. And the Nazis knew from the 10,000 people, perhaps only half had turned up. So where are the other 5,000? And they really, really were very thorough to catch everybody. So they made house searches. So at night, always at night they knocked on doors of people. Even Dutch ordinary people had to open the door, had to let the Nazis come in and search their homes. So in every hiding place, we had a hiding place within the hiding place. So when the knock came, we quickly went into this hiding place. But for instance, we heard a story in another apartment where there were Jewish hiding. The beds were still warm when the people quickly went into hiding place. So they demolished the whole apartment till they found the people. And the host people were arrested as well. So, you know, people became scared. So in the 2 years that we were hiding, we moved perhaps 7 times into different hiding places.
What about the betrayal? Tell us about that.
So it was 1944. We were already hopeful the war won't last much longer. And my father phoned my mother. We were in touch by telephone. They were in the country at the time. The woman where they were staying is blackmailing them for more money. Well, if you can't go to work, my father couldn't go to work. Of course, our money had more or less disappeared. And with the war might still last perhaps 6 months or even a year. So my father said, we have to move. Please find us a new hiding place. But by 1944, it was really, really difficult. And eventually, a Dutch nurse came forward and said she's knows a safe place. As it turned out, she was a double agent. She really worked for the Nazis. And when they took my father and brother to this safe house, the Nazis came in with their own keys and took them away. And we had just moved to a different place, and it was very near where my father and brother were going. So we visited them on a Sunday when they had moved. And on Tuesday, it was my 15th birthday, and there was a knock on the door, and they opened in the morning. It was always safe, and the Nazis stormed in and took us away. So they had followed us when we visited my father and brother, so they knew where we were. So being in two different places had not helped. We all four were taken away.
Talk about the experience of the boxcar on the train, your ride to Auschwitz.
Yeah, if you have seen pictures or you might have heard about it, the transport of Jewish people was not in ordinary trains or in buses or in trucks, but I call it, you call it boxcar, but it was like a container. When I see trains going now through different cities, you know, big metal things. The only thing is that it had a big iron door, but there was, of course, no window, just a tiny little slit, which was made with a barbed wire across, and about 80 people were pushed into it. There was just boards, you know, we could not sit anywhere. There was not enough room anyway for people to sit, so most people had to stand. Metal, it was very, very hot. It was a very hot May season at the time. So there was 2 buckets put in, one for 80 people to use as toilet, 1 bucket, and the other one was for clean water. So once a day, this was changed. It was, of course, an unbelievable mess and stench. And once a day, when the doors were open and those buckets were changed, they threw big chunks of bread in, not enough to feed 80 people. So you can imagine those 3-4 days we were traveling was agony. The only good thing was that we were together as a family. And my brother, I'll just tell you a little bit about him. He was a wonderful musician. He could play the piano, he had an accordion, he had a guitar, he composed, because in hiding he had to be very, very quiet, because, you know, nobody was allowed to know that people were living there. And so he started to paint, and he created some beautiful artwork, oil paintings, and he told me that was actually the last conversation I had with him, that before they escaped from this woman who blackmailed them, he hid the painting under the floorboard in that house with a note on it, "This belongs to Heinz and Erich Geiger, and after the war he's going to pick it up again." And then eventually the train stopped.
And you arrived at Auschwitz, and you and your mother, or Mutti, as you called her, were separated from your father, Papi, and Heinz. That must have been very difficult.
Not just we were separated, but if ever you go later perhaps to visit those terrible camps, you might realize how huge this Auschwitz was. Auschwitz is the name of the whole complex. There was a women's camp called Birkenau, another work camp called Monoway, other different parts of the camp. It was a huge, huge area of perhaps 10 square miles of death camps. And men and women were in different parts of the camp, so men and women never ever met or saw each other. So the men had to walk away to Auschwitz, and you can imagine to separate from your father, from your husband, from my mother, from her son, assuming perhaps they will never ever see each other on earth. So you can imagine terrible, terrible scenes of clinging to each other, crying, and so on. My father, who was not really a religious man, took me by the hands, looked at me very, very sad, and said, God will protect you. And then they marched away, and we were left there. And then we heard rumors, people calling, being rather scared, Mengele is coming. Of course, we didn't know who Mengele was, but Mengele was a camp doctor. There was a proper medical doctor, but he wasn't there to look after the health of people. He was there to decide at arrival who was going to die or who was going to live. So we had to stand in rows of 5 this way, and he came, looked you over, and in a fraction of a second, he decided this side was that side, meaning life or death. We lost half of our transport, all the children, all the older people, old, could have been 40, 50, it depends how you looked. If you had a bad journey, you were a bit sick, you were perhaps a bit pale, you went to the wrong side. Of course, we didn't really our brain stopped working. We didn't really want to know where those people were going, but we had our suspicion. Because where we were in hiding, so you were not allowed to listen to foreign broadcasts, only to Dutch and German. But the British, the BBC, then broadcast out to all the occupied countries, all in their own language. And so you were, as I say, you were not allowed to. The people where we were hiding, of course, wanted to know what was going on in the world. And so we listened to the broadcast. And it was always at 9 o'clock, the Dutch broadcast, and they told how the war was going, but they always ended up with warning people. There are over 300 death camps in Germany, in Poland, and Auschwitz is the biggest in Poland. And in that camp, Jewish people were systematically gassed. So when we realized we were in Auschwitz, we didn't really expect our life would last, perhaps not even a day. So I just turned 15. You can imagine how that must have felt. So we lost about half our transport to the other side, and then we were herded like cattle, not walk normally, quick, and dogs were walking next to us, and if you went out of line, the dogs jumped on you, and they did, not at this beginning, but later I did see dogs tearing people apart. They were really there trained to kill people. So we were taken into a huge barrack. The next thing was undressed completely naked. And the young SS men were laughing at our embarrassment. Can you imagine? All our clothes were thrown on the floor, were collected. And there was a place, later I found out this, it was called Canada, meaning plenty and a good life. It wasn't plenty, it wasn't a good life, but it was some work which was a little better than other things. Everything was confiscated. You can imagine millions of people were taken to the camps, and people had suitcases, people had baby carriages, people had sticks, people had glasses, false limbs. Everything was taken away and sorted in this place called Canada and shipped to Germany. The Germans would never have been able to carry on the war so long without those looted possessions, because they supplied the bombed cities with it. Because they didn't have to make so many clothes or the furniture. When people in the occupied countries were arrested, their furniture, their whole apartment or their whole house was emptied out, and all this was shipped to Germany. So in this barrack, we were told, you are going to be tattooed, you get a number, you are not a human being, you are like a cattle. Then all our hair was shaved, And while this was going on, they told us with much pleasure and laughing that the family you've been separated, who went to the other side, were taken to a shower. But it wasn't a shower, it was no water, ha ha ha. But they've started to expect, to get water. Nothing came. Within 15 minutes, they felt faint, fell to the floor, and were dead. Because through those pipes, which really looked like showers, very, very poisonous gas came through. And so you can imagine how a mother felt who had been separated from her child. So then we were herded out, still naked, and there were two heaps, one enormous mountain of clothes, and we were thrown one garment. You might have seen pictures of Auschwitz, so it's just striped, we called it pajamas. That was actually quite an honorable clothes because it was solid, it was quite, was kept clean, but we just got rags. One garment could have been a winter coat or a dressing gown. The next heap was shoes. You were thrown 2 shoes, never, of course, a pair, never your size. It never had laces. If it was big, very often you always had to run. You lost your shoe. You were not allowed to stop a second to pick it up. Then you were barefoot. We were taken in a barrack, 3 high bunks. Nothing was in it. No straw, no cushion, no blanket, nothing. The only thing which was in it was bed bugs and lice. So within days we were itching, we were full of animals, which became wounds when we scratched. Washing was practically impossible. Once a day we were taken to a block at the end of the camp where there were some holes which were toilets and a couple of taps which was dripping. So you really gave up to try to get there to a tap. So you can imagine we're filthy. Every morning we were taken out to work, physical, very, very, very hard work. We got a little mug of liquid in the morning. In the evening, a chunk of bread. That was all we ever got. How long can you survive that way?
It's so unimaginable. You were at the doorstep of death various times at Auschwitz, and yet miracles happen. Could you just share one with us?
The beginning, just tell you quickly, when we were arrested, we were just arrested in our clothes, and that is how we were transported. But my mother got from a good person in the holding camp a hat and coat. And when we were queuing up there for this first selection from Mengele, my mother gave me her hat and coat. And was a big hat with a big rim. And when Mengele looked at me, he didn't realize how young I was. So this is how I survived the first selection. In our transport, there were girls from 17, 18 years even, perhaps relatively small, and they were taken out and didn't survive. A book came out about all the transport from Jewish children from Holland who were deported. And I found, of course, my transport there. And it said there were 187 children in our transport, and only 6 survived. And I was one of the 6.
On January 27th, 1945, the Russians liberated Auschwitz. How did you find out that Otto Frank was still alive? Towards the winter of 1944, the Russians on the Eastern Front, if you look it up on a map, it's quite interesting where Poland was, and the Russians were defeating the Germans in Russia and were starting to enter Poland, and we didn't know that. We had no idea
that the war might end soon. But the Germans, of course, knew that. And they had started, and they didn't want Jewish people to be liberated and be freed. So they started to evacuate. Every day they emptied many, many barracks and marched the people into Germany and Austria. And as well, many, many, many Nazis disappeared as well because they didn't want to be captured by the Russians. And so one day, it was very, very, very quiet, and we got out from the night, and we realized the Germans had fled. So we were on our own for about 10 days till the Russians came. But of course they were fighting, they were pursuing the Nazis, so they left again. And we were left again on our own. There were perhaps 500 women left at that time in Auschwitz, where I was with my mother. And so I decided I would go to the men's camp to try to see if my father and brother were there. So I got to Auschwitz, and again about 500 men left. The rest was all evacuated. And I looked everywhere around, and I found a few people who looked familiar, and I went to him, and he looked very ashen and very thin and very sad. But I thought and he looked familiar. So I asked him, I think I know you. He said, yes, I'm Otto Frank. And he looked at me and I said, and you are Eva Geiringer, Anna's friend. I said, yes, yes. So the first question, of course, he said, have you seen my girls or my wife? And you know, the camp was so big, they were somewhere, I had never seen them. But he had seen my father and brother. So that was January 45, and I was very, very hopeful that my father and brother would still be all right. The war might end perhaps in a matter of a few weeks, and we would be reunited and life would be get back to normal. But the war lasted another 5 months, wasn't finished till May in Europe. Of course, in the Far East it was much, much longer, in Japan. But I mean, that didn't really affect Europe at the time. And so the Russians took us eastward because we couldn't go back to the west. And we traveled till June. So from January till June, the Russians went westwards and we went eastward. And very often we had to wait for weeks on a sideline because the army had to go, of course. And eventually we ended up in Odessa, and there we heard about the end of the war in May, that the Germans were defeated. And then, of course, there was great happiness, but we were very anxious to get back to Holland or to Belgium or to France, because it was very, very international from all the European countries. There were Greek people from everywhere. They had deported Jewish people. And eventually we came back to Amsterdam.
You were very fortunate when you came back to Amsterdam because your apartment was available. That didn't happen very often.
No, you know, I told you we had no furniture. So when we get to Amsterdam, my father took a furnished apartment belonging to a non-Jewish person. And she let us back in again. But all the other Jewish people, as I told you, when people were arrested or they went into hiding, the furniture was emptied and other people moved in. You didn't own apartments, you rented it. So Otto Frank, when he came back, had nowhere to go. And if you've read the diary, how of you, many people have read the diary of Anne Frank? Put up your hand. Yeah, well, if you've read that, you have seen how they were in hiding. And so it was a bit different from us, who were not as a whole family, but they were arrested, of course, as well, a little bit later than we, and as well deported. But Otto had nowhere to go, and he went to Miep Gies, who was one of the helpers. And she had, of course, found the diary after the family was taken away, she went up to the hiding place and cleared up. And the diary was on the floor with many, many loose pages. Anne wrote not just a little book, she wrote a lot more. And she picked it up and kept it in her desk and was going to give it back to Anne. So when Otto came back, she didn't give it to him. But several weeks later, Otto found out, he heard from somebody who had been in the same camp where the two girls were taken, that both girls had died in April. And only then did Miep give Otto the diary.
When did you find out that Pappy and
my father
Heinz had perished?
Had perished. I still had great hope. People came back from Germany, from Poland. Every day we went to the station. We put adverts in the paper. And then we got a letter from the Red Cross saying to my mother, we have to tell you that your husband, Erich Geringer, and your son, Heinz Geringer, perished in Mauthausen, this terrible Austrian death camp, several days before the American army came to liberate that camp. Well, that was my last straw. You know, I had survived because I hoped life would get how it used to be. But when I realized it will never ever happen, I became very, very depressed. And the worst thing really was that I didn't believe it. I couldn't accept it. I thought my father, who was such a strong, he was just 45 years old, such a strong, sporty man, you know, I have survived, he must have survived. And for years, when we heard a car coming or somebody walking up the steps outside, I rushed to the door and I thought, he's going to come back. But of course he didn't. And you know, can you imagine how did the Germans or the Red Cross, how did they know the name of my father and my brother? They must have found just bodies. That is still to this day, I just don't understand how they knew that.
Otto was very lonely and he started coming over to your apartment and visiting you and your mother, and what happened?
And you know, I was very, very full of hatred. And he was really a great help to me. He who had lost his whole family, he was 57 years old, he had married late, had his children late. He was, you know, relatively older man, and he had really nothing to live for. And I thought he must be full of hatred. And he said, no, I don't. And the funny thing was, and later when he told it to my children, they were surprised. He always said, you know, I love Germany, I love the German people, I'm a German myself. He was an officer in the First World War, he fought for Germany, and he said, I love their language, I love their literature, their music. My family has lived in Germany since 1500, and he really felt a German. But I said, look what they've done, they murdered your whole family. He said, yes, look through history, you will see every nation has committed terrible crimes, and this time it was the Germans. But I couldn't believe, you know, I couldn't believe it. I still was very, very miserable. I hated everybody. I went back to school, but I couldn't relate to my classmates. I felt I was already an adult. When they made a joke on a teacher, you know, they thought it was hilarious, but I felt very sad for the teacher who couldn't keep the class in order, you know. So there were teachers like that. Children were very naughty. And especially the chemist teachers, they put wrong things in their things and it blew up and things like that. I don't think you'll do that. Anyway, when I finished school, I didn't know what to do with my life. And Otto and my mother decided I should become a photographer because I was quite artistic and I was not really, I was restless. I didn't want to go to university or something like that. And so Otto found me a place in London for me to become an apprentice there. So I went for 1 year to London, and I lived in a little boarding house where lodgers were, and there was a young man who had come from Israel to study economics. And we became friends, and we went for long walks. And after 6 months, he said to me, "Eva, I've fallen in love. When I finished my studies here, I'd like to get married, and we can go and start a life in Israel together." And I said, "No, thank you." And he was quite shocked. "Don't you like me?" I said, "Yes, I like you, but I have a widowed mother in Amsterdam, and I'm going to go back." You can imagine, I was very, very close to my mother, and I couldn't imagine I would just desert her. And then Otto Frank came over one day, who kept a bit an eye on me, and I introduced him to this young man, and I said, he asked me to marry him, but of course I refused, because I'm going back to Amsterdam. And then Otto became a bit embarrassed, and he said, "Well, you know, your mother and me have fallen in love as well, and once you get settled, we like to get married." So I went back to this young man and said, "Well, you can marry me now," which he was very happy. And we went back to Amsterdam because we didn't know anybody in England, and we got married there. And when my mother met him, she asked him not to take me so far to Israel, because at that time you didn't fly, you know, in the early 50s, you had to travel by boat, which took a week, which was quite expensive. And my mother said, "You know, that's the only child, the only person I've got left, so please stay in Europe." So we decided we would stay in England. And so still lives there. And we were married for 62 years. So we didn't really know each other. You know, we took both a big gamble on each other. But it was obviously a good choice.
I just want you to share the story about when Zvi wanted to marry you, and you had a boyfriend back home, right? And you asked your mother for advice, and what did she say?
Yeah, and before I left to England for a year, I was going out with a nice Jewish boy, and we planned to get engaged when I come back and get married. And again, you know, I didn't know what love was. You know, I really was still full of the terrible memories and hatred, and you can't imagine if you go through such terrible, terrible things, when you see humanity at its worst, you can't just go back to ordinary life. And especially, you know, if you've lost your family in Holland, my mother and me was the only family we had. And, you know, it takes a long, long time to get over, to get a normal, but I really wanted to settle down. I wanted to have a family of my own. And I was ready to marry a nice person, but love was ready, not at that time. There was no really love in that. And so I had met those two boys, and I liked them both, so I asked my mother, who should I marry? And my mother said, well, Zvi, the boy from Israel, so he wasn't Israeli, he was a German refugee. He's more serious, he's quite clever, he's an intellectual. And you know, my education was interrupted a lot when I moved from those different countries in different language. I had to, you had to redo a class, so I was in school with younger children, and then when I was 2 years in hiding and 1 year in Auschwitz, so my education was really missing a lot of things. And my mother said, Zvi, this little boy, will teach you a lot, will uplift you, and the other boy is very funny, is lighthearted, but you won't have a depth in your life. So she advised me to marry Zvi, which I did, and as I say, we were married 62 years, and it was really a very, very happy marriage.
So you should listen to what your mother tells you to do.
Well, you don't always know what you get. You know, you don't know people till you live with them.
Eva, you were chosen to be one of the select few Holocaust survivors from all over the world to be part of Steven Spielberg's hologram project. We just saw 116 cameras, and I want you to talk about and first of all, I want to mention that short documentary was chosen to be one of 10 that were up for the Short Documentary of the Year award last year to receive an Oscar. And then it made the cut, and you were the final five.
It nearly got an Oscar, not quite.
And I still think it should have. But anyway, could you tell us about that interview process that you had to go through?
Well, you have seen this huge globe with 160 cameras attached, and it took a whole week for me to sit every day in there and in the same position because it's used now in schools, in museums, and so children might ask one day and then they might come in the afternoon, and so I must not be a different person. I must be always in the same position. And I was asked over 1,000 questions, which children can ask. But just last week, and this hologram used to be in New York for a year, and now it's in Chicago permanently in the Jewish Museum. And the people from there came to interview me now while I was on the road, and there was 6 hours interview, and they wanted again to hear my whole life story, because they realized that if kids come in 10 years, 20 years, they might not know anything about my story. So what should they ask? So they have to, before they come to see this image of me, but it looks really as if I'm alive and I move and I talk and so on. They must really know my story. So before they go in to see this, they're going to get a small film and hear about who I was, and then they can go and hear and try out to ask questions.
As I remember,
so it's a long process.
Yes, and you had requested a certain color outfit that you were going to wear, but they made you wear gray. What color did you want?
I wanted blue because that was my favorite color, and on the picture actually it looked slightly bluish, but it was really completely gray, and I had to wear this a whole week, and I wasn't too happy about it. In Auschwitz I wasn't vain, but now, when you go normal life, you would like to look nice and wear the colors you like, and gray I thought was a bit a dreary color. But anyway, that is what it is. So this is my future image, will always be in gray.
Always in gray.
Now I wear blue, as you can see, partly, but this is gray actually.
Recently you were in the news, made the headlines because some high school students in Newport Beach, California had a beer party, and they arranged the beer cups into a crude swastika, and then someone took a photo of them giving the Nazi salute, and it went viral on social media. And you were asked to speak to these students. Could you just comment on that?
Did you hear about this incident? No.
Yes.
Because it was all over the news. It was quite a revelation that those 16-year-old kids, they had a party, and they did Hitler salute and swastikas, and somebody put it on social media, and it made world news. Even in London, my family sent news that they've heard that article, it was on television, about this outrage. And so they asked me, I was not going to speak to that school. I had given a talk before at a university, but they asked me if I would try to speak to those children and find out their motive, why they should have done anything like that. And it was going to be a meeting with the children and the parents. And so I said, yes, I would like to do that, because I really wanted to find out why they were doing anything like that. And so we met up in the school. They were expelled, by the way, for 10 days. And later I heard that those 10 days they had to go to LA visit the Jewish museum. They had to do essays about different subjects about the Holocaust. They had classes, so those 10 days were spent only on Holocaust education. And so by the time I started to ask them, why on earth did you do anything like that? They were very, very embarrassed and didn't really want to give me an answer, but eventually they said, we didn't really know what it meant. And that was for the principal of the school. He was actually just as embarrassed as the children. And I said, well, with a 16-year-old, don't you teach anything about the Holocaust in your school? And he said, well, with 16, we did these 2 terms now, we did American history, and the next term we were going to go and do Holocaust education. But I said, well, with 16, it is much too late. And the parents were as well, I accused the parents as well. It is not only for the school to educate the children about what is happening in the world, but for the parents as well. You know, this is such an important, and long ago, 70 years ago, but by now, really, you all really have to know about the atrocities which are happening in the world. And you know, there is a lot and lot of books, a lot of movies, a lot of information, even on your internet, that you can find out. And you know, there's still killings going on now, there are genocides happening, and we have to learn from the past. And so every child, you know, I think with 10, 11 years old, you can start to be informed a little bit. You don't have to read the terrible, there are some terrible, terrible books, very graphic, but, and there's films which are graphic, but a little bit you have to learn about it. And it's such an amazing thing that a cultured people like the Germans were able to do anything like this. So, you know, you have to learn how can people do things like that. It's, you know, it's a very, very important study to educate yourself and to try to work together. And this is really the purpose of my talk, to educate you about what has happened, but as well to realize that you have to take part in what is happening in the world. You will be the future. You soon will be able to vote. And we are a democracy. We have a right to tell our government what we want. And we should really live in a more harmonious world. Prejudice against different religion is not acceptable anymore. Prejudice against different races is not acceptable. We are all human beings. We have the same right to the same education, to the same jobs, and then we will have a peaceful world, and we give everybody a chance to bring up a family and live a decent life. We are blessed with a wonderful globe, with a wonderful earth, who can provide enough food, enough housing, enough money for everybody. And this is what is the purpose of my talk is, to educate you to become good, decent human beings and speak up when you see injustice being done.
Eva. Despite growing up in a less than wonderful world, you have had quite a life. You had 2 prosperous businesses. You and Zvi raised 3 daughters. You have your grandchildren. You're going to turn 90, May 11th. And you speak all over the world. And we are so grateful to you for coming. Thank you so much. That was wonderful.
Just the right time?
Yes.
Thank you. We still have some questions for you. You were a wonderful audience. Very attentive. Thank you. And we look forward to hear some of your questions.
Yes. Okay, great.
Onward. Okay. Did you ever find your brother's painting under the floor?
That's a great.
Yeah, you're on.
That's a great question. He wants to know if Eva ever found her brother's paintings under the floorboards.
Well, I must admit, through all the things that has happened to me, when I came back and, I heard that they wouldn't come back, I'd forgotten about that. But after Otto got the diary, and it meant so much for him, I said to my mother, we have to go and try to get those paintings. But in that house where they were hidden, that was a woman who blackmailed them, and through that, all this had happened to us. So we were very afraid, really, to go there, to confront this woman. But when we got there, she had disappeared, and other people were living in it. So I knew exactly where Heinz had described where the paintings were, and indeed I found over 30 amazing oil paintings. And a few years ago, I donated them to the Resistance Museum in Amsterdam, so that many, many people can see it.
Thank you.
What were your brother and father's main personality traits? Would you say?
Okay, again.
What was her father's and brother's main personality traits? What were they like?
Yeah. He wants to know what your brother and father were like. What were their personality traits?
My brother was, I was more a tomboy, he was a gentle, much more gentle than I was. As I say, he was very, very talented. He was really composed, but in hiding as well, he taught himself 6 languages. He had plenty of time. He played chess with himself, not on a computer, but just he played both sides. And he painted. He was a very, very gentle, wonderful young man. And he was murdered when he was just 17 years old. This is something I will never forgive the Nazis for doing that. My father too, he was 45 years old. He was full of life. He left behind many, many writing books about what he was going to do in future when he gets, after the war, because he had a shoe factory, but he was going to do quite different things. Unfortunately, it's lots and lots of writing, but I have not been able to decipher his writing. So I don't really know what he has written, but I'm still looking for somebody who will be able to read this. It's a very nice handwriting, but it's in German you had not the ordinary Roman alphabet, you had a different writing as well. And he wrote it in this writing, which I did learn for a bit, but I've forgotten it.
Yeah.
What type of games did you guys play whenever you were hiding, you and your brother?
Okay. What kind of games did you play when you were in hiding? Now, she wasn't in hiding with her brother and father.
Yeah,
and you spent many hours with your mother.
Very good question, We didn't play games. But we were sitting with my mother, people who we were staying, we went out at work, and the apartments in Holland are quite lightly built, so we were not allowed to walk around or go to the toilet and pull a plug or anything, because the neighbors might think they're burglars and they might call the police. So we had to sit like this, day in, day out. I was not a reader at that time, so my mother tried to teach me some lessons so that when I could go back to school that I wouldn't be so behind. But at that time I was a bad pupil, so my mother lost her temper with me and I started to cry, so it didn't work. And I started to knit a little bit, I draw a little bit, but day in, day out, 2 years to sit like that, So it was terrible. I missed my friends, I missed my family, I missed playing outside. So it was a really, really, really hard time. And then we were, of course, afraid every night they might find us. So it was a really hard time, but nothing compared to what happened afterwards.
Thank you. Next. Is there another one?
Hi, you said that your brother was creative, and I was wondering if you were creative as well, or if you were, and if you were artistic, what did you do? Like what?
Okay. You said that Heinz was very creative and artistic, and she's wondering if you were also.
I was very handy. I did fretwork afterwards. You know, it's a saw from thin wood, you cut it out. And I painted as well a little bit, but not as good as my brother. No, I used to be quite technical, but now I was good in math and in the science. But now with the computer, I'm very, very bad. And my mother always used to say when she was still alive, I don't know, you used to understand all those things. Now you don't seem to get it anymore. But I'm now a big reader, which I never used to be. So, you know, you change. When you get older, you change, you get different talents.
But I want you to know she's very good at emailing, so give yourself credit.
So you said that you had to do a lot of hard labor in the camp. That was like the main job. What were the kinds of hard labor that the Nazis made you do?
Okay. He's wondering about the labor that you had to do in the camps in Auschwitz.
Well, we had to, you know, there were 10,000 of people, and very often there wasn't even enough real work to do for us. So there was one couple of months I had to do, just carry big, heavy rocks to one place in the camp. Whole rows of us had to carry those rocks. And then other groups had to take it again from there, take it somewhere, just to keep us occupied. But as well, we had dig trenches. And what I did later, and you might think it was not so bad, it was called Weberei, which is called weaving, but it wasn't weaving. We were sitting on the open ground, which was frozen, you know, not in a room, but just in a barrack, freezing cold. There was in the middle a big table, and they put material, hard material, thin silk, rubber things even, and we had to make plats an inch wide, and we had to make every day 200 yards. And we had to tear this material, no scissors of course, or knives, we had to tear it in strips and make plats of it. And if you didn't make the 200 yards in the evening, they measured it, or if it was not strong enough, if it broke, if it happened a few times, you were killed. And our hands were frozen, so to do it and to tear this material apart was as well very, very difficult. So many people never were able to make so much, and they were taken out and were killed. I was in the beginning quite quick, so sometimes I helped somebody else when I'd done my measurement, but at the end, you know, your hands get so stiff and so cold, you can't do anything. So it was a life-threatening job. And they said it was later cut into 90 centimeters, and it was used for throwing hand grenades. That's what they told, but I'm not sure if that's true. But it must have had some purpose for the war.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
So unfortunately, our buses are here.
Oh, sure.
But let's give another round of applause.
Thank you, thank you.
Thank you. I just want to tell you, you have been a fantastic audience. I mean, I am so proud of all of you. I really am.